Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got one that I've been looking forward to doing for quite a while. It's been a while since I've done one of these, and you're going to know immediately why I'm so excited today. Today we have got another review of beers I've sourced from Tavour, and it's a single brewer, single style. We've got Gigantic Brewing Company's Massive, which is a bourbon barrel aged barley wine, my absolute favorite style of beer. And we've got a 2019 release and a 2018 release. Gigantic Brewing Company, we've done quite a few of their beers. They're based out of Portland, Oregon. So today, we're just looking at two different year releases of their bourbon barrel aged barley wine. And we're going to be starting with the 2019 release. This one clocks in at 14% ABV. And then number two, the 2018 release, which was slightly higher actually, at 14.3% ABV. So jumping in, for the first time in a while, the granddaddy of all beer styles, the absolute king, barley wines. And we're going to kick off with Gigantic's Massive 2019 release that clocks in at 14% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in with the first beer of today's Tavour review, single brewer, barrel-aged barley wine review. We have got Gigantic Brewing's Massive 2019 released, a bourbon barrel-aged barley wine, clocks in at 14% ABV. Gigantic Brewing is based out of Portland, Oregon. So first things first, let's start with the label art. Gigantic tends to have reasonably interesting label art, and on these, they've got what looks like a cross between a goat and a piñata. So that's kind of the theme on the label, and it's rather colorful. It's very interesting. I like it. And they do tell you a little bit about kind of what they put into here and blah, 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 but we know the story. They're using the absolute daddy king of all beer styles, barley wine as a base, and then they're bourbon barrel aging this bad boy. So barley wines in and of themselves, they're the biggest, boldest, most pungent, complex beer style of them all. And then we couple that with some bourbon barrel aging, and I imagine this is just going to be next level. So without further ado, I'm going to get this cracked, and we're going to jump right in to this bad boy. So let's get this poured right in the glass. I'm using my stout glass. I don't have a dedicated barley wine glass. Stout glasses, as porter glasses, and any all-purpose style glass really does well for barley wines. So let's go ahead and get this poured. All right, pouring this in, this looks like very much a classic barley wine appearance. It's kind of a caramelly brown. Some are a little lighter, some are a little darker. This one's on the darker side of that caramel color, so it's got a good bit of depth of color to it. And it's forming an okay head, which I expect that's going to dissipate reasonably quickly. They tend to be pretty carbonated in terms of beer styles. Visually, yeah, it's cloudy in appearance. You're not going to see light through it, but it's very much a dark caramel brown. It's a very lovely color. And aroma-wise, it's very pungent. I can smell it from here. I can smell that bourbon, and I can smell the classic barley wine aromas coming through. They're very complex beers. So let's get right up on it for a deeper sniff. Oh yeah. Tons of caramel, tons of plum, apricot, figs. It almost reminds you of a sticky toffee pudding. That's the aroma that comes through most common to me on a barley wine. And really, it's an amalgam of aromas just as it comes through in the flavor. It's very complex. It's layers of rich, deep fruit. There's a lot of caramelization that you get in both aroma, and I expect to come through in the flavor, and just tons of different fruit. Tons of different elements. There's these underlying malt elements, there's these underlying fruit elements, there's these underlying sugar elements, and that all comes through quite clearly, and the bourbon on top just puts it over the top. It smells really, really nice. So without further ado, let's jump right in for that all-important first sip. Mmm. Mmm. Oh, oh, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh, oh, that is fantastic. That is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, so the first thing that hits you as you agitate around the palate, when the flavors first start to make their presence known before you swallow is, ooh, that bourbon barrel comes through quite clearly. And yes, it does. Barley wines are already a big, bold beer style. They're a beer style that gives this nice warming sensation. And this one's no different. It's absolutely there. And the bourbon is just kind of playing on and layering on that fact. Behind the bourbon, you immediately get, which you could pick up quite clearly in the aroma, and you could kind of guess from just looking at it. There's a lot of deep toffee and caramel-like flavors that come through in here. And these aromas that you could pick up, the figs, the apricots, even candied peaches and plums and raisins, they're all coming through in the flavor. So you've got just loads of caramelized sugar, loads of these bourbon qualities that are coming through. So it's very deep, it's rich, it's got this caramelized sugar, it's got molasses, it's got vanilla. And then on top of that, you're getting figs, raisins, plums, you're getting all of these deep, rich fruit, and it really is mixing with this toffee and caramel-like quality. So it really is almost like a sticky toffee pudding, which pick your ingredients, and that's what's all coming through in this. And then you have this beautiful warming sensation. I gotta say, maybe the intensity on the warming sensation on this one is not quite as intense as some, but the length of it is very, very long. Normally the warming sensation you'll get up front, and within a second or two will disappear. This one's not as intense, but once it hits you, it's got a slow, very slow, it's not even a bell curve, it's a slow slope. I mean, 10, 15, 20 seconds, you're still getting that warming sensation down there, and it's just positively delicious. Complex layers of flavor, complex aromas. So I'm gonna jump in for one more sip here. Let me add a little more. I'm gonna top this off just a tick. We're gonna have plenty more in this bottle to finish topping. Jump in for body and mouthfeel and explore this flavor development. It's so complex, it's gonna take a couple more dives minimum. Body on this one is medium heavy. Medium heavy to heavy. It's somewhere on the border. It doesn't feel quite as robust as you would anticipate for a barley wine in this ABV range, 14%. Barley wines tend to be bigger, but this is a pretty good ABV on a barley wine. It's not quite as robust in terms of breadth that you would anticipate, but it is still on the border between medium heavy and heavy. It's right there. It's on the fence. It's got good breadth. Maybe not quite what I expected for the ABV, but it's still there. It's not weak. In terms of mouthfeel, there's a good bit of resistance. There's a little bit of a sensory experience that I would call thickness without it being viscous, but it's got resistance to it, and you can tell there's thickness to the beer. And let's be fair, 14%, it's got a lot of fermentables in it. No question about it. There is resistance to this beer, and there's breadth to this beer. Maybe not quite to the extent that I anticipated, but it's there. It doesn't feel flat. It doesn't feel weak at all. In terms of flavor development, it's all over the board. Each sip I have is a little bit different, but the common element here is it starts with this bourbon quite clearly, and then that warming sensation, and then kind of the malt bill influence with this caramel and toffee layers that come through, and then all of these other interesting flavors develop. The raisins, the plums, the molasses, the caramelized sugar, the figs, the kind of apricots and peach in the back. It's almost like just this rich this rich toffee caramelly pudding that's just been layered with caramelized fruit. That's the best way I can describe it. And that's very common for a barley wine, and this is no exception. It's all in there. It's very complex. I'm going to jump in again for the finish and see if I can pick out a little more layering in the flavor, but it's very, very complex beer. Very complex indeed. Boom. Bourbon up front. Massive hit of bourbon. Warming sensation. Caramel and toffee start to creep in, and then you're getting these richer fruit undercurrents. You're getting figs, you're getting raisins, you're getting plums. And it starts to open into some sweeter, riper fruit, but still caramelized. It's got this caramelized sugar motif going. You're getting peaches, you're getting apricots. It's very much stone fruit and rich, deep fruit. Obviously, raisins aren't stone fruit, but you know, it's rich fruit that are coming through. There's a suggestion of grapes on the end as well, but it's more vinous than anything. It's more of a wine-like suggestion of grapes. It's very nice. Elements of this don't put me out of mind of a really nice Chardonnay, which is not uncommon again with the barley wine. It's a big ABV, it's got that warming sensation, it's got these rich fruit layers to it, and they're all coming through. There's just tons of elements, and that vanilla from that bourbon back is just coming through, which is putting me more in mind of a Chardonnay. Just delicious beer, layers of complexity. In terms of the finish, how it finishes, it's pretty long. Most barley wines are. This has that bourbon barrel, so it's helping to push and extend. Otherwise, I think that the bulk flavors, they peak in intensity, and then it's got a pretty quick and pretty steep slope on the bell curve, and then it's relatively even to the end. But that bourbon is just pushing it out and out and out and out. And I can tell you that toffee and caramel flavors that are coming through from the malt bill, they're really extending as well and pairing with that bourbon. So you're getting a lot of length from there. It just keeps writing and writing and writing. Very, very long finish. Very, very multi-layered complexity to the flavors as well as the aromas in this beer. This is just a slam dunk of a barley wine. I love them anyway, but this is a very, very, very well done example. If this 2019 is giving me anything to go on, this 2018 may have even more layers of nuance. So I'm very excited to jump into that one as well. I'm going to take my time, sip on this 2019 release, come up with my scores. When we come back, we're going to get to the 2018 release. Same beer, little higher ABV on this one at 14.3% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's gigantic bourbon barrel-aged barley wine review. We have got the 2018 release of Massive. Same beer, same name, just a year older, so 2018 release. This one's 14.3% ABV. The 2019 was a 14%. Again, they're based out of Portland, Oregon. And yet again, the label art is pretty much the same. It's got a goat in what looks like some kind of piñata decorations, kind of interesting, but nonetheless, remarkably similar. So now we're going to get these cracked and just see how similar or how different they are, having different year releases and an extra year in the bottle. So let's get this poured. Already visually, this looks pretty much indiscernible from the first. It's got this kind of caramelly brown color to it. Notably though, this one is not forming quite as robust of a head. And the carbonation is still active. I can see it in there, but it really is quite a bit slower. So it didn't get that much of a head. Yeah, visually pretty much identical. This one, just as with the first, is very pungent in terms of aroma. I can smell it, I'm about a foot away, and I can smell it. So let's get right up over it and see what we think. Okay. Pretty much indistinguishable aroma and appearance-wise from the 2019 release. You get the big bourbon up front, and there's just very caramelly, very toffee-like, and figs and raisins and apricots and like candied peaches. All of these aromas that we discovered in the first one are coming through in this one as well. There is a little underlying hint of kind of a molasses back and that vanilla, and that's probably being imparted from the bourbon, but it could be part of this malt bill as well. But it smells great, almost identical to the first. Same thing with the appearance. If anything, this one's just a little bit darker. So let's just jump right in, give this a sip. Ooh, so this one is very nice, but flavor-wise, it's quite a bit different than the first. It's mellowed quite a bit. You do still get this nice warming sensation, this bourbon up front, but it's taken on more qualities that are more wine-like than beer-like. Now I'm still getting a lot of the rich undercurrents of the toffee and caramel come through in the flavor, as well as kind of this vanilla, this molasses candied sugared back in here. But overall, in terms of the layers that I was picking up in the aroma with the fruits such as figs and raisins and apricots and candied peaches, they're not really making their presence known in the flavor profile. It tastes a lot more vinous, V-I-N-O-U-E-S or vinous, and really much more wine-like. There's a lot more grape-forward like flavors that are coming through. And it kind of reminds me almost like those big, very large red globe or green globe grapes. I know there's a specific type of wine that they make from those grapes, and I can't recall the name of them. I don't know. I'm not that big of a wine person, but it tastes very much like that. And there was an element of a Chardonnay-like quality in the first one, but it's very pronounced in here. It's a lot more wine-like than the first beer was, which had many, many layers from the malt bill, obviously classic barley wine, just barrel aged. That's still present here, but it does have a lot more grape and wine-like quality to it than the first beer. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel, explore these flavors a bit more. Body on this one again, kind of on the fence between medium heavy. It's not as robust as you would anticipate for the ABV, but it doesn't feel small. It's still got presence. In terms of mouthfeel, pretty much identical to the first one. There's a little bit of resistance. There's a slight thickness, but it's not what you would call viscous or syrupy. It's just got a little resistance to it. Again, the mouthfeel isn't quite as prominent in terms of thick quality characteristics as you would perhaps anticipate for this ABV range, but it doesn't feel flat either. So pretty much identical in terms of body and in terms of mouthfeel. Really, the main differences that I'm picking up from the first two, slight deviation in appearance, slight deviation, well, pretty large deviation in how well it formed and retained a head, but really is much more coming down to having mellowed out quite a bit that extra year in the bottle, and the flavors that are coming through are a lot more mellowed. And they open up in a lot of different directions. So it's not as bold, it's not as intense and in your face. You could almost say it's a more mature beer. Now, everybody has their own personal preferences, so one that's kind of chilled a little bit in terms of intensity and develop some underlying additional flavors that you wouldn't normally get might be preferable to some. I'm not judging. I'm just telling you what I'm experiencing here. I certainly have my own personal preference, and we'll get to that in the scoring and the reviews, but this is a really, really nice beer. I'm going to jump in for one more sip here and explore this finish and get final thoughts. I love that bourbon up front, and then it's got this slight warming, but you get these really wine-like qualities that are coming through, mixing with that toffee and caramel and the underlying fruit, and then there's this wine and grape-like quality that was not present in the other. In terms of how the flavors develop, they don't reach quite the same level of intensity at their peak in this one as they did in the first. But the length of the finish and the overall shape of the arc is pretty much the same. It's not a huge up, huge down. It's very subtle, very shapely, like a classic bell curve. And what you get on the end of this one is very similar to what you got in the first. So it's overwhelmingly got that bourbon back, and then you're getting these malt characteristics, the toffee and caramel kind of notes underneath, and then some of those rich fruit and caramelizations. It's very, very nice. This is well balanced again. A very nice beer, very well balanced beer, very tasty. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, come up my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the 2019 release of Gigantic Brewing's massive bourbon barrel-aged barley wine. They're based out of Portland, Oregon. Starting with the aroma on this beer was huge. It's just smelled fantastic. You could smell the barrel, and every classic aroma that I normally get in a barley wine came through with positive pungency. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste, I loved it. Admittedly, this is my absolute favorite style of beer, but there are good barley wines and substandard barley wines, just as there are with any other beer style, and this one was just tremendous. The bourbon barrel was a really great choice for this style of beer. It has a lot of elements that pair well with it, but it was just layers of flavor upon layers of flavor, and they just blended so beautifully, and they were so intense. It was a real home run for me. It gets a 10 out of 10. Moving on to the body. Body on this beer was robust. Make no question about it. It was a robust body, but it was nowhere near as large as I expected for a 14% ABV. Still above average, though. It gets an 8 out of 10. Mouthfeel. Similar story. It wasn't flat. It did have resistance to it, but it didn't have as much as I anticipated for a beer in this ABV range. It's got a lot more fermentables in it, going to add natural thickness, but it didn't translate itself to a super viscous mouthfeel, which I did anticipate. Still above average, though. It gets a 7 out of 10. Finish on this beer was ridiculously long. I mean, this is absolute top tier, ridiculously long. It gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention. This is a category where barley wines, you never really know what you're going to get. Newer, fresher barley wines, this is a 2019, tend to retain their carbonation better, and they do tend to be a pretty highly carbonated style. That can sometimes work for head retention and creation, sometimes against. In this case, the 2019, it did a great job. It really formed a nice head, and it had really good staying power, well above average. I only thought it missed the mark by 1. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the appearance, this was a textbook barley wine appearance for my money. It's that dark brown, almost slightly caramelly. It's exactly what I picture in my head when I think of barley wine. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was absolutely incredible. The bourbon barrel aging didn't get lost in there. The bourbon came through very, very prominently, but as did all of these other dimensions of flavor that come through in a barley wine. It was toffee, it was caramel, it was figs, it was raisins, it was apricots, it was candied peaches, it was everything in between, and it was just fantastic. All of that perfectly came through in balance without vying for supremacy on the palate. I thought it was a perfect 10 out of 10 for the balance. Feeling in the intangible. I loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of this style, this beer did not lose that many points in that many categories. The lowest it had was a 7 in the mouthfeel. Okay, so the body and the mouthfeel, I would have liked a little more robust nature, but still, I mean, we're comparing for the style in the ABV range, and but compared to standard beer, it really didn't miss the mark. Overall, I thought it was exceptional. I gave it a 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Gigantic Brewing's 2019 release of Massive to a 94 out of 100. This is top tier barley wine. If you're a fan of this style, I do highly recommend this one. Moving on to number 2. Same beer, different year release. 2018, slightly higher ABV, 14.3. It did have some noticeable differences between the 2019, so we're going to go through them. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was very nice. It was certainly well above average in pungency, but it was nowhere near the level of the first. Above average, 8 out of 10. For the taste, I enjoyed the taste of this beer, but it was a little muted, certainly in intensity compared to the first, and also it had a completely different layer of flavors that came through. This one was more vinous in quality. It really put me much more in mind of more wines than an actual barley wine. There was this underlying grape-like quality that really kind of cut through some of the expected and anticipated flavors. It was still nice though, above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the body on this was identical to the first. It gets an 8 out of 10. Same story with the mouthfeel. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was very, very long indeed. Well above average, but it was not quite as long as the first, and not as long as I anticipated for a barley wine of this caliber with an even higher ABV. Docked 1 point, it gets a 9 out of 10. Head and retention. This is the category that kind of surprised me, but not entirely. I mentioned in the beginning, kind of run of the gamut. This one didn't seem to be retaining as much active carbonation, so that head had a harder time forming, and it certainly didn't retain very well at all. It gets a 1 out of 10. For the appearance, while they were slightly different in appearance, they were both perfectly right in the realm of anticipated appearance for barley wine. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance, yet again, the balance on this beer, really both of them, was exceptional. The flavors were different than I anticipated, and it did lose a few points that the first one didn't, but overall the balance was still struck beautifully. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I really enjoyed this beer, though subjectively I did not enjoy it anywhere near as well as I did on the 2019 release. I did appreciate those wine grape-like qualities that came through, but frankly, I was missing out on a lot of the intensity of classic barley wine flavors. Notably, the caramel and toffee, I would have wanted more intensity, and I was missing some of the subtleties of different fruit and the molasses and caramelized candied sugar interplay, just because the grape prominence was so great. But I did still think it was above average subjectively. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. This one scored pretty similarly to the first, with the exception of my subjective in the head and retention. It is what it is. You know, there's nothing I can do about it. But frankly, I still thought this beer was exceptionally well done. I only docked 1 point overall. It gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Gigantic's 2018 massive release to a 78 out of 100. So still well above average. Granted, that is a 16-point spread, a 94 versus a 78. They were both exceptional beers, and depending on what you like in barley wines and different characteristics that come through with different aging times, you may have a preference one way or the other. But either way, I can recommend both beers if you're a fan of barley wine. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can just click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.